My name is Marian Keaton. I'm 63. That night, the house smelled like lemon polish and roasted chicken. The kind of scent that pretends everything is in order. I'd spent the whole day preparing dusting the shelves, setting the table with the good china, and arranging flowers from the corner market into a vase Olivia said clashed with her aesthetic. But it was all for her parents' visit, and she wanted everything to look perfect. So it did. The dining room shimmered under soft lamplight. Candles flickered beside wine glasses I'd bought for Ethan and Olivia's wedding 6 years ago. They'd been too busy to notice I still kept them wrapped in tissue, polishing them for nights like this. I'd done the same with the silver cutlery heirlooms from my mother that I wasn't sure anyone would inherit now. Olivia came downstairs 20 minutes late, smelling of expensive perfume and stress. Her mother followed, perfectly tailored and curious, scanning the space like an appraiser. Ethan was on his phone near the sideboard, typing something fast, his brow furrowed. When he saw me carrying the roast from the kitchen, he smiled a polite, distracted curve of his mouth. "Mom, you didn't have to go all out," he said, barely glancing up. "I know," I replied, setting the platter down. "But it's nice to have everyone together." He didn't answer. Olivia's father nodded to me, friendly enough, though I caught the faint surprise when he realized the older woman arranging the plates wasn't hired staff. It happened often now, the mix of disbelief and polite silence. I took my usual seat at the far end of the table, close enough to refill drinks, far enough to fade when conversation picked up. Olivia took the head, her voice bright and smooth as she guided the evening like a hostess trained for it. She talked about her new business deals, about Charleston's creative market, about how hard she worked to keep their home magazine ready. Ethan nodded, inserting a few words here and there, sipping the wine I'd picked up on discount from a local shop. Their laughter rose easily. Mine stayed tucked behind my napkin. I listened. I always did. I listened when Olivia said she'd managed to keep this house up so well. And when her father joked about how expensive old Southern homes could be, Ethan said nothing. I caught his eye once, hoping he'd say something like, "Mom helped," but he didn't. He only smiled at his wife, the way men do when they think peace is worth the silence. Dessert was ready in the kitchen, peach cobbler, her father's favorite, but I hesitated before standing. Olivia's mother was studying me, chin tilted. There was something behind her polite smile, something measuring. The clink of silverware softened. "And you are," she asked finally, with that careful pause Charleston socialites use when trying to sound kind. Before I could answer, Olivia laughed. "Oh, that's Marian," she said lightly. "Our unofficial maid. She keeps the house running." Laughter spilled like a dropped glass. Her mother chuckled. Even Ethan laughed, low and uneasy. The sound hit harder than any word could have. I stood still, my hand on the wine bottle, fingers cold around the glass. It was the same hand that had signed the mortgage, painted the trim, fixed the leak under the sink last spring. The room blurred for a moment under the candlelight. I managed a smile because that's what women my age are trained to do, and set the bottle gently on the counter. "Excuse me," I said. My voice sounded steady, foreign. I walked to the kitchen, past the framed photographs I'd hung years ago, and closed the door behind me. Through the wall, their laughter continued, muffled and distant, as if it belonged to another house entirely. I stood there in the quiet hum of the refrigerator, tasting salt at the back of my throat. For the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I was home or if I had simply stayed too long in someone else's. Outside, thunder rumbled over the harbor. The candles flickered. The night that had looked so perfect began to tilt. Just slightly. The way a table leans before everything on it slides to the floor. I stood by the kitchen counter, listening to the faint rise and fall of their laughter. The sound slipped under the door, each laugh sharp enough to cut through the hum of the dishwasher. My hands shook just enough for me to notice. I gripped the edge of the sink until my knuckles went pale, waiting for the sting to fade. It didn't. For a moment, I thought about walking back in pretending I hadn't heard a thing, smiling as I refilled their glasses like some quiet servant who belonged to no one. It was the instinct of a lifetime: smooth the edges, keep the peace, make it easier for everyone else. But my body refused. My legs stayed rooted where they were. In that dim kitchen that suddenly felt too small for air, I stared at the roast on the counter, the one I'd spent the morning marinating. The rosemary sprigs had gone limp under the heat of the lamps. Everything I'd done, every dish, every clean surface was supposed to prove I still had a place here. Yet it all looked like evidence of exactly what Olivia had said. "That's our maid." Her voice had been light, amused, practiced. A tone I'd heard her use with clients on the phone, half laughing, perfectly controlled. I could picture her mother's reaction too, one of those tight, polite chuckles people give when something feels uncomfortable but familiar. And Ethan, my throat closed at the thought of him. My son, the boy who used to press dandelions into my palm and call them flowers for Mom. The same boy who once said, "When I grow up, I'll buy you a big house so you never have to work again." I had done all the working. I had bought the house. Now he laughed when they called me the maid. Through the doorway, their voices shifted. Olivia's mother was complimenting the meal. "You're lucky," she said. "Some people can't keep a household running this well without help." Olivia replied with a soft, pleased hum. "It's not easy," she said, "but I manage." I felt something inside me tighten, a quiet, invisible thread pulling until it threatened to snap. I took a breath and poured myself a small glass of water. The sound of it, that faint stream against the glass, felt too loud. I carried it to the back door and stepped out onto the porch, letting the cool night wrap around me. The air smelled of rain and jasmine. Charleston in late spring always did. The streetlights glowed through the mist, halos against the wet pavement. I stood there, half in the dark, half in the yellow wash of light spilling from the dining room window. I could see their silhouettes, Ethan's shoulders, Olivia's quick gestures, her parents leaning forward, amused and full of wine. It was like watching a play I'd once performed in but was no longer part of. A neighbor's cat brushed against my leg. I bent down and stroked its fur just to feel something that didn't hurt. My pulse began to steady, though my chest still ached in that deep, private way you can't show anyone. When the laughter inside finally faded into clinking glasses and low conversation, I went back in. The dining room smelled of sweetness and smoke. Olivia's mother was dabbing her mouth with a linen napkin. Her father was complimenting the cobbler. No one looked at me as I cleared the plates. Not one word. Ethan murmured something to Olivia about her presentation at work on Monday. She smiled, leaning close enough to kiss his cheek. I stood a few feet away, invisible in my own home. By the time I'd finished in the kitchen, the rain had started a soft, steady tapping against the windows. I wiped my hands on a towel and leaned against the counter, my reflection faint in the glass of the microwave door. My face looked older than it had that morning. Not because of time, but because of what it costs to pretend you're not hurt. When they finally left for the evening, the house was quiet again. I turned off the lights one by one, moving through each room I had cleaned, painted, paid for. Every corner still smelled like me, my soap, my polish, my cooking. Yet somehow, it no longer felt like mine. I locked the front door, pressed my palm flat against the cool wood, and let the silence settle. Upstairs, the guest room light was still on. I could hear faint laughter drifting from behind the closed door, the kind that lingers long after the joke has died. I climbed the stairs, step by slow step, not to confront anyone, but simply to breathe the same air one last time before it changed forever. I didn't sleep. Not even for a minute. The house creaked through the night, settling into its bones like it always did. But this time every sound felt strange, as if it no longer belonged to me. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold. The faint light from the street lamp outside cut across the floorboards, falling over the framed deed I'd pulled from my dresser drawer. The paper was yellowed. The ink slightly faded, but my name was still there. Marian Keaton, bold and centered. It was my handwriting on every check, my initials on every loan renewal, my hours behind the counter at the grocery and the logistics office to make each payment. I could still remember the day I signed those papers at the bank. The air thick with Charleston humidity and the faint buzz of ceiling fans that never cooled anything. Ethan had just finished college. He'd been full of plans then, talking about starting a business, maybe traveling for work. I'd said yes to the house so he could have a home to build from, so he wouldn't have to start from nothing, like I did. I thought that mattered. Now I wondered if all I'd done was teach him that comfort could be taken for granted. The clock read 3:14. I heard Olivia laugh faintly upstairs, her voice slipping through the vents. Even in her sleep, she sounded sure of her place. I turned my gaze back to the deed, the numbers, the notary's stamp, the bank's seal. They all felt heavy with something I'd forgotten how to claim. Outside, rain began to tap against the window pane. I let it. I sat still and listened to it fall, the soft rhythm steady as breath. Somewhere in that sound, between the ache of exhaustion and the sting of pride, a thought began to take shape. It wasn't anger, not yet. Just the quiet realization that something was about to end and I was the only one who knew it. By morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the world gray and still, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm, thick, heavy, expectant. I had already packed a small bag before dawn, one change of clothes, my documents, and the framed deed I'd kept near the bed. Everything else could stay. Downstairs, the smell of coffee drifted faintly through the kitchen. Olivia was already there, her hair tied up, wearing one of those pale yoga sets she called work clothes. She didn't look surprised to see me awake so early. If anything, she seemed irritated that I was still around. "Oh," she said, glancing up from her phone. "Didn't realize you were up." "I didn't sleep," I answered. My voice sounded calm, almost gentle. "I was thinking about what you said last night." Her expression flickered just for a second before she smiled. "What did I say?" I set my purse on the counter and opened the drawer by the fridge. One by one, I took out the keys, the front door, the back, the garage, the mailbox, the one to the storage shed I'd built myself. I placed them neatly in a small pile, the metal clinking against the granite. Olivia frowned. "What's that?" "The keys," I said simply. "All of them." She laughed, uncertain. "Why would you?" "Because it's your house now," I said. "At least that's what you've been telling everyone. So, good luck paying the mortgage." Her hand froze midair, phone forgotten. For the first time since she'd moved in, she looked unsure of herself. "What are you talking about?" "You'll figure it out," I said, taking my coat from the chair. "The bank statements are in the top drawer. Taxes are due next month." Ethan's footsteps sounded from the hallway. He appeared barefoot, hair rumpled, eyes half awake. "Mom." I turned to face him. For a moment, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who clung to my arm at school gates, who thought I could fix anything. But that boy had grown into a man who let his wife call his mother the maid. "Where are you going?" he asked. "I'm leaving." He rubbed the back of his neck, confused. "Leaving? What are you?" I picked up my purse. "You'll be fine." "Mom, wait." Olivia's voice broke in, sharp with disbelief. "You can't just..." "But I could." I had done harder things in my life than walk away from people who no longer saw me. I walked to the front door, each step light, steady. The morning air seeped through the cracks, cool against my face. I could hear Ethan behind me, his bare feet on the wood. His voice softer now. "Please don't do this," he said. I didn't answer. I opened the door and stepped outside. The light hit my eyes soft, silver, honest. Behind me, I heard the doorframe creak, the sound of a life I had built tightening to hold itself together. I didn't slam it shut. I closed it quietly, the way you do when you don't want to wake anyone. My car was parked by the curb, the one thing I still owned outright. I slid into the driver's seat, the leather cold beneath me, and gripped the steering wheel until my heartbeat slowed. Through the windshield, I saw Ethan standing barefoot in the driveway, watching. Olivia hovered behind him, her phone still in hand, as if waiting to record a scene she didn't understand. I started the car. The tires rolled over the wet pavement with a soft hiss. I didn't look back. The apartment on Trad Street was smaller than I remembered. My late Aunt Ruth had lived there until the end, a quiet woman who collected teacups and never threw away a calendar. Everything still smelled faintly of lavender and paper. I turned on the single lamp by the sofa and watched the light fall across the room. Dust floating like tiny ghosts in the air. I set my bag down and sat for a while, letting the silence fill the space where voices used to be. It wasn't the same kind of quiet I'd known in my house, the kind wrapped in tension, waiting for footsteps, or sighs, or laughter that wasn't meant for me. This quiet was different. It was clean. It asked nothing of me. The clock on the wall ticked softly. I found a small spiral notebook in one of the drawers, pages yellowed but blank. I sat at the kitchen table and began to write. Not letters, not lists, just words, pieces of thought that had nowhere else to go. I worked for that house. I built it one payment at a time. They called me the Maid. The sentences looked strange in my handwriting. Too bare, too honest, but I didn't stop. The pen moved until my hand cramped, until the ache in my chest started to ease, just enough to breathe again. Outside, Charleston hummed quietly distant traffic. A dog barking, the whistle of a late train cutting through the damp night. Life was still happening somewhere, but for the first time in years, it wasn't rushing through me. When I finally stood to make tea, the kettle took forever to boil. I didn't mind. The waiting felt right. The sound of the water rising to a slow simmer was the only thing that kept me company. And somehow, it was enough. The next morning, sunlight poured through the lace curtains, warm and uninvited. I hadn't meant to stay awake all night, but the quiet had a way of keeping me company. When I finally rose, my body felt heavy, as if it had been carrying something invisible for too long. I made coffee and sat at the small table by the window, the one my aunt used to keep covered with crossword puzzles and receipts. My notebook from the night before lay open, the words slanted and raw. I turned the page and drew a single line across the top. The house. It wasn't anger that guided me. It was something colder, steadier. I reached for my old file box, a small metal one with a broken latch that I'd brought with me out of habit more than foresight. Inside were the things I never thought I'd need again: tax forms, utility statements, bank ledgers, and the mortgage binder I'd kept since the day I signed for the property on Rutledge Avenue. The papers were neatly stacked, yellowed at the edges. Each one told the same story: my name, my address, my payments, every line, every dollar, every year mine. The last statement, dated just before I retired, showed the final balance cleared. The mortgage was paid in full 5 years ago. Olivia and Ethan hadn't contributed a single cent. I read the numbers twice to be sure, my finger tracing the printed figures as though touching them could anchor the truth. The longer I looked, the lighter I felt. It wasn't relief exactly, it was recognition. I hadn't lost the power I thought they'd taken from me. I'd just forgotten where I'd put it. The clock ticked toward 9. Somewhere across town, I imagined Olivia scrolling through her phone, Ethan pouring cereal in the kitchen I'd remodeled, both of them believing the house was theirs. It was almost funny, almost. I spent the rest of the morning sorting every document into labeled envelopes. Old habits from my office days came back easily. Mortgage statements in one stack, insurance and taxes in another, notarized copies of the deed in a third. When I finished, I spread them across the table and looked at them the way some people might look at photographs, each page a small proof of existence. Midway through, I found a folded receipt tucked between 2 older files. It was from the hardware store on Spring Street, dated 10 years back. Exterior paint, white oak trim. It read, I remembered that day. I'd been repainting the porch railing by myself, sweating through the humidity while Ethan watched football inside. He'd been too busy to help, though he'd later boasted to his friends that we had redone the porch that summer. I'd let him have the story. I always did. I took another sip of coffee, bitter and cooling fast, and opened my laptop. The bank portal still recognized my name as the account holder for all property taxes and utility bills. Every automatic payment I'd set years ago was still active, still drafted from my account. The house, in every legal sense, was mine. A faint satisfaction spread through me, not sharp, but steady, like warmth from a low fire. I didn't know what I was going to do yet. I only knew that for the first time in a long while, I wasn't powerless. By noon, the table was covered with papers. I stacked them neatly, tied them with a rubber band, and placed them in a manila folder. Then I sat back and looked around the apartment, its cracked ceiling, its uneven floorboards, its smell of thyme and lavender. My aunt had lived here her whole life without needing anyone's approval. Maybe she'd known something I didn't until now. Outside, the wind picked up, stirring the curtains against the frame. I gathered my papers, slipped them into my bag, and stood by the window for a long moment. Across Charleston's rooftops, the church bells began to chime the noon hour, deep and slow. I thought of the house on Rutledge, the one that held all my years and laughter and labor. Let them believe it was theirs, I thought. Let them play host in rooms I had built. Because the truth printed, stamped, notarized sat right here in my hands. 2 days later, I found myself standing outside a narrow brick building on Broad Street, its brass plaque gleaming faintly in the late morning sun. McAllister and Reed, attorneys at law. The glass door reflected the pale sky behind me, and for a brief second, I almost turned around. It had been years since I'd stepped into an office that wasn't for paying bills or signing someone else's papers. The lobby was small, but orderly mahogany trim. The faint scent of lemon polish, and a woman at the front desk who greeted me with a professional smile. Mrs. Keaton, she asked. Ms. McAllister will see you now. Denise McAllister looked to be around my age, maybe a few years younger. Her gray hair was pulled into a bun that didn't ask for attention, and her voice carried that soft Charleston rhythm I hadn't heard in a long time. She gestured to a chair across from her desk. Please, sit. I've read the summary you sent. You said you still have the deed in your name. I slid the folder across the desk. She flipped through the documents with deliberate care. Tax statements, bank records, the mortgage payoff letter. Her eyes moved quickly, but her hands stayed steady. After a few minutes, she looked up. Well, she said, there's no question here. You are the sole owner of the property. It was purchased under your credit, your income, and your name. They've never been co-signers. The quiet that followed was oddly comforting. So if I wanted to sell it, I asked. Her expression didn't change. You could. You have every legal right to do so. But let's take this one step at a time. She picked up a pen and drew a quick outline on her notepad. We'll start by drafting a letter of verification from the county office. That confirms ownership and clears any chance of dispute. After that, I'd advise listing through a third-party agent, not directly. Keeps things impersonal. Impersonal sounds perfect, I said. Denise smiled faintly. Good. We'll handle communication through my office. If your son or his wife tries to contact you about the sale, refer them to me. You don't owe them explanations. Her words landed softly, but they carried weight. For the first time since that night, I felt the air loosen in my chest. Mrs. Keaton, she continued, leaning back slightly. What you're doing, it isn't vindictive. You're reclaiming what's yours. That's not revenge, that's balance. I nodded, unable to answer right away. There was a lump in my throat that had nothing to do with anger. It was the kind that comes when someone finally says the thing you've been afraid to believe. Denise pushed the folder back toward me. I'll have the paperwork ready within the week. Once the title is recertified, you can choose how to proceed. Until then, you might want to start thinking about what comes next. What comes next? I repeated quietly. She stood, extending her hand. Freedom, she said simply. Outside, the afternoon light had softened into gold. I walked past the old churches and narrow storefronts, the city breathing around me. The bell tower at St. Michael's chimed noon, echoing off the cobblestones. Each note felt like a step forward, like the steady sound of something finally clicking back into place. By the time I reached my car, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of salt from the harbor. I opened the door, placed my folder on the passenger seat, and sat there for a long moment, the papers resting beside me like quiet proof. The world outside looked unchanged, but I knew better. Something had shifted. Not in the city, but in me. By the time the ownership papers came back from Denise's office, Charleston had settled into its humid summer rhythm, tourists on carriage rides, magnolia blossoms drooping in the heat, and the faint tang of salt carried up from the battery. I sat in the small cafe across from the county courthouse, folder open beside my coffee. Every document was stamped, verified, legal. My name stood firm on every page. Still, I waited before doing anything. A part of me wanted to see what they would do next, how long they could keep up the illusion that everything was fine. Olivia's world had always looked perfect from the outside. Her lifestyle brand, Olivia Ascends, filled social media with crisp white interiors, motivational quotes, and perfectly filtered mornings. I had never paid much attention before, but now I watched. There was something hollow in her posts, every caption a little too polished, every smile a little too wide. I found the business website through a link on one of her videos. It offered personal growth workshops, mindfulness coaching, even luxury retreats. But the contact address led to a rented office space on King Street, the kind paid for by the hour. Her list of clients were mostly tagged influencers, people selling the same image back and forth like borrowed jewelry. I scrolled through her posts late into the night, the screen light washing the apartment in a pale glow. Every photo felt staged, every word desperate. There was a kind of sadness in it I hadn't noticed before. Ethan appeared in a few of them smiling, holding champagne, wearing suits I knew he hadn't bought. He'd been laid off from the insurance firm last year. Though Olivia had told her parents he was consulting independently, I wondered how long that story had held. The next morning, I drove past the house on Rutledge. The shutters were open, and through the window, I saw Olivia at the dining table, phone in hand, pacing as she spoke. Her gestures were sharp, impatient. Ethan sat nearby, staring at a laptop, jaw tight. The perfect home looked different now. I noticed a stack of unopened mail near the door, Thick envelopes with red notices. Debt. I thought, it has a way of changing the air in a room. I parked a few houses down and watched for a while, feeling no pride in what I saw, just confirmation. They had built their lives on image, not structure. The foundation had always been mine. Later that afternoon, I called Denise to confirm the next steps. Her tone was steady as always, but I could hear approval in it. "Take your time," she said. "Truth works best when it's quiet." That evening, I walked by the waterfront. The tide was low, the air heavy with heat. Couples strolled by, laughing softly, their shadows long against the cobblestones. I thought of the years I'd spent keeping things afloat, balancing bills, saving for repairs, hiding worry behind calm smiles. All that invisible work, the labor no one noticed until it was gone. At a bench near the edge of the pier, I sat down and looked out over the harbor lights. For years, I had mistaken endurance for love. I'd believed that keeping everything running smoothly was my way of protecting family, but it had only taught them that I was part of the furniture, useful, replaceable, unnoticed. Now, as the water rippled below, I realized they had taught me something too, the art of pretending. Only I was done pretending. When I drove back toward Trad Street, the city's street lamps flickered on, one by one. I passed Olivia's rented billboard near the shopping district, the one advertising her wellness summit. The poster showed her smiling against a golden background, her hand resting on Ethan's shoulder. The words beneath read, "Live with integrity, lead with love." The irony made me smile, not bitterly, but quietly, as if I finally understood the language of their world. They'd lived too long behind glass, mistaking reflection for truth. And glass, I knew, only holds until the first small crack. The morning the notice went out, Charleston was quiet under a pale stretch of sky. I sat by the window with my second cup of coffee, the documents neatly stacked on the table beside me. Denise had sent a short message an hour earlier, filed and confirmed. They'll receive notice by 10. I looked at the clock on the wall. 9:57. Outside. The street was waking up, delivery trucks groaning down Trad Street, the mail carrier stopping at the corner, the faint sound of church bells echoing somewhere downtown. I wrapped both hands around my cup, its warmth steadying me, and waited. At exactly 10, my phone buzzed. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Ethan's name glowed on the screen, the same contact photo I'd never updated him at 12 years old. Sunburned from a summer trip to Folly Beach, his grin wide and gap-toothed. For a moment, my heart clenched so hard it almost made me reach for the phone. But I didn't. The ringing filled the room once, twice, 3 times before fading into silence. When the screen went dark, I turned the phone face down on the table. I stood and went to the window. From the 3rd floor, I could see the rooftops of the city stretching toward the harbor, the air shimmering with heat already. Somewhere across those streets, in that house I had built, they were reading the papers. I imagined Olivia, first the disbelief, the anger, the denial, her fingers flying across her phone, calling Ethan, her voice rising. And Ethan, maybe still in his robe, hair a mess, scrolling through the document, realizing what it meant. The mortgage, the deed, the right to sell all mine. No warning, no conversation, just the truth, stamped and sealed. I thought of the years I'd spent preparing meals for them, paying utilities without being asked, watching my savings drain in the name of family, every unspoken apology, every effort to keep the peace. It had bought them comfort, not gratitude. And now, comfort was ending. I sat back down, the old chair creaking beneath me. For a long time, I didn't move. I let the quiet settle like dust around me, soft but certain. There was no triumph, No sense of victory, only a stillness that felt heavier than joy and lighter than guilt. When the phone buzzed again, I didn't turn it over. I already knew what it would say: questions, excuses, disbelief. There would be messages later, maybe apologies dressed as confusion, but I had spent too many years answering to people who never truly listened. I reached for the pen on the table and drew a small check mark next to Denise's note in the folder. Filed and confirmed. Simple words, yet they carried the weight of every year I'd been silent. Outside, a light breeze moved the curtains. The sound of the city drifted in cars. Laughter. The faint ringing of a bicycle bell. Life kept moving. And for once, it didn't demand anything from me. The clock ticked past 10:30. I poured the rest of my coffee down the sink, washed the cup, and set it carefully on the drying rack. Then I picked up my bag, slipped the phone inside, and left it on silent. Whatever came next, it could wait. It was late afternoon when I heard the knock. 3 short raps, hesitant, uneven. I was sitting on the couch with a book open on my lap, though I hadn't read a single line in over an hour. The light outside had turned gold, spilling through the lace curtains and across the floor. For a moment, I hoped it was the landlord or the mailman, but something in the pause between knocks told me it wasn't. Then I heard his voice. Mom. The sound of it made every muscle in my body tighten. It wasn't the confident tone Ethan used when talking to Olivia or his friends. It was smaller, uncertain, almost frightened. I didn't move. He knocked again, louder this time. Mom, please, I just want to talk. Through the door, I could picture him exactly barefoot again. Maybe still wearing the same gray sweatshirt he used to paint the guest room years ago. There would be a crease between his brows, that same one he got when he lied and couldn't admit it. I didn't know, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Olivia didn't tell me about the notice. He stopped, exhaling hard. We can fix this. We'll figure it out. I rested my palm flat against the door. The wood was cool under my hand. The sound of his breathing carried through the frame, shallow and desperate. You're not answering your phone, he continued. I've been calling all morning. I know you're in there, please. I looked around the apartment, the little table with my papers stacked neatly, the notebook where I'd written every memory I wanted to keep, the quiet space I had made mine. It was the first home in years that didn't echo with someone else's voice. I took a slow breath. Ethan, I said finally. The sound of his name startled even me. He froze. Mom. Yes. Can I come in? No. There was silence. Then a sharp inhale. Why not? Because I have nothing left to explain. He let out a small, strangled laugh. You're really doing this. I already did. I said, the papers went through this morning. I heard him lean against the door, his weight pressing lightly against the wood. We'll lose everything, he whispered. You'll lose what you never owned. I answered softly. He didn't speak after that, only the faint scrape of his shoe against the hallway floor. I could almost hear the thoughts tumbling behind his silence, the shock, the anger, maybe even shame. I stayed where I was, my hand still on the lock, feeling the rhythm of my heartbeat through the metal. After a long pause, he said, I didn't mean for things to get like this. I thought, his voice cracked, I thought we were helping each other. You were living, I said quietly. I was helping. He didn't argue. The quiet stretched between us, long and heavy. For a moment, I almost turned the knob. But then I remembered every time I had stepped aside, every time I'd chosen peace over truth, and how it had only made me smaller. The floorboard creaked as he shifted his weight. I don't even know how to talk to you right now. He said, you don't have to. I said, will you at least call me maybe? I said, when I know what to say. Another silence. Then footsteps, slow and dragging, faded down the hall. I stood there long after he was gone, listening to the quiet return like the tide. I didn't cry. I didn't move. The world outside dimmed into evening, and the last light of the day stretched across the floor like a thin line of gold. Stopping right at my feet, I turned the deadbolt gently and walked away from the door. The listing went live on a Tuesday. Denise had sent me the link that morning, along with a short note that read simply, "It's official." I clicked it once, just to see. There it was, my house, stripped of the meaning it once carried, now reduced to a real estate description and a set of bright photographs. Charming 4-bedroom on Rutledge Avenue, the caption read, featuring restored hardwood floors, open kitchen, and elegant crown molding. It looked beautiful, almost too beautiful. The listing agent had done their job, well-angled shots, warm lighting, every flaw hidden. I recognized the kitchen counter where I used to knead dough for Ethan's favorite biscuits. The staircase I had sanded myself after work. The porch where I once sat with a glass of iced tea and a quiet sense of pride. Now, the only thing left of me in that house was its perfection. By noon, Denise called. "We already have 2 offers," she said, her tone brisk, but pleased. "Cash buyers, both from out of state. The market's moving fast. You'll have a choice by the end of the week." "Good," I said, stirring sugar into my coffee. "I assume you don't want the current occupants contacted directly." "That's right," I replied. "Let the notice do the talking." There was a pause on the line, then a quiet chuckle. "You're handling this better than most." I smiled faintly. I've had practice letting go. After we hung up, I sat at the table by the window, scrolling through the listing again. It was strange how quickly something could shift from home to inventory, from life to property. That afternoon, my phone began to buzz. Not from Denise, but from numbers I recognized too well. Ethan, then Olivia, then her mother. I let every call go to voicemail. When I finally checked the messages, the pattern was familiar: pleading, anger, denial. Olivia's voice was the sharpest, brittle at the edges. "Marian, this is outrageous. You can't just, there are procedures. We have rights." Then a pause, a short breath. "At least call Ethan. He's not himself." The last message was Ethan's. His voice was quieter, almost hollow. "I don't know what to say. I guess you won. I just don't understand why you couldn't talk to me first." I didn't reply. I'd spent years explaining myself to people who never really wanted to hear the truth. Silence was simpler. Silence was clean. By evening, I opened my laptop again. The listing had been shared on several housing sites already, each one drawing attention. Comments, tags. Strangers online were admiring my old home, calling it a Charleston dream. Some even said it looked like something out of a magazine. I scrolled through the photos slowly. The house did look like a dream, just not mine anymore. I noticed details others wouldn't. The faint crack near the window trim where I'd once hung Christmas lights. The shadow of an old water stain beneath the rug. Every imperfection hidden behind soft lighting and careful captions. But no amount of polish could hide what it really was, a stage set. And off stage, I knew the actors were falling apart. Later that night, as I walked along the Battery, the air smelled of salt and night-blooming jasmine. The lamps flickered against the cobblestones. Somewhere, music drifted from a distant bar. I thought of Olivia in that big, echoing house, watching strangers comment on the property she thought she owned. I could almost see her, pacing between rooms, calling agents, realizing that every conversation ended with the same truth: it was never hers to lose. I stopped by a bench near the water and sat down, pulling my coat tighter around my shoulders. The city lights shimmered across the waves, the same color as the brass fixtures I'd polished in that kitchen years ago. People always said houses hold memories, Maybe that was true. But they also hold mistakes, expectations, and the weight of people who never saw you until you were gone. And now, for the first time, mine was finally empty enough to breathe. Denise chose a quiet cafe on Meeting Street, one of those places where the air smelled faintly of roasted beans and old wood. We sat by the window, morning light spilling across the table between us. She arrived with her usual calm, organized folder in one hand, coffee in the other. "The sale's progressing quickly," she said. Setting the folder down, both offers came in over asking. "I'd recommend the second better terms. Fewer contingencies." I nodded, taking a sip of my coffee. The bitterness grounded me. "And once it closes, you'll have full discretion over the proceeds. Legally, it's clean. Emotionally." She gave a small, knowing smile. "That's another story." I smiled back. "I think the emotional part has already happened." She opened the folder and turned a few pages toward me. The documents were neatly arranged offer sheets, escrow details, signatures waiting in thin black lines. Everything that had once been overwhelming now felt simple, orderly. "You've handled this better than most clients I've seen," Denise said. "Usually, people come in burning for payback. I was. Once, I admitted, but I realized revenge needs an audience. Truth doesn't." She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "That's well put." Outside, the city moved at its usual slow rhythm. A group of tourists passed by, laughing, their voices echoing through the open window. Somewhere down the block, a church bell chimed 11 times. Denise slid a pen across the table. "If you're ready, we can finalize this week." I studied the papers. My name appeared in the same crisp font I'd seen so many times before on loan forms, on tax bills, on checks I'd written in another life. Only this time, it felt different. My name wasn't tied to weight anymore. It stood alone, steady and clear. I signed where she indicated. My hand didn't shake. When I looked up again, she was watching me not as a lawyer, but as someone who understood what it meant to reclaim something without shouting about it. "You know," she said softly, "it's not every day I see someone let go so gracefully." "I'm not letting go," I said, closing the folder. "I'm just holding differently." She smiled, a quiet kind of respect in her eyes. That's strength. "Marian, don't lose it." We finished our coffee in companionable silence. When we stepped outside, the air had shifted the kind of late morning warmth that made everything smell faintly of magnolia and sea salt. As Denise walked toward her office, I lingered by the curb, the papers tucked safely under my arm. There was no rush, no sense of unfinished business. The house would sell, the world would move on, and for once, I didn't need to win. The truth had already done that for me. The knock came just after sunset. 3 firm strikes against the door, confident. Not pleading this time. I knew before I opened it that it wasn't the landlord or a neighbor. There was a certain rhythm in the sound, the way it paused between hits, that belonged to Ethan. I stood there for a long moment, hand resting on the knob. Before turning it, he looked different, older, maybe, though only a few weeks had passed since I'd last seen him in the hallway outside. His eyes were rimmed red, his jaw unshaven. The exhaustion on his face was sharper than guilt. It was the look of someone who had finally run out of excuses. "Mom," he said quietly, stepping inside without waiting for me to invite him. "We need to talk." I closed the door behind him and nodded toward the chair across the table. "Then talk." He sat, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "Olivia's losing it," he began. "She can't sleep. She's calling everyone agents, lawyers, even her parents. They said you filed for sale. Is that true?" "It is." He shook his head slowly. Why are you doing this to us?" "To us?" The word left my mouth before I could stop it. I took a breath, forcing calm into my voice. Ethan, I'm not doing anything to you. I'm just ending what's already been done to me. He looked up, confused. You're selling our home. My home, I said evenly. Your home was my generosity. I paid for it. I maintained it. I kept it standing when you couldn't. His eyes darted to the folder on the table, the same one Denise had handed me after the final meeting. The deed was inside, along with the verification letters and closing statements. I didn't push it toward him, but I saw his gaze fix on the corner of the document peeking out. You're serious, he said. Yes. He exhaled sharply and stood, pacing the small kitchen. This isn't you, he said. You don't do things like this. You forgive. You fix. You don't. I used to, I said quietly, but forgiving people who don't respect you isn't kindness. It's surrender. He stopped pacing, his face tightening. You're punishing us. No, Ethan, I'm protecting myself. You just can't tell the difference because you've never seen me do it before. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You could have told me. You could have given me a chance to explain. I gave you years of chances, I said. Every time you looked away when she talked down to me. Every time you called me over to help out while I was still paying the bills. You didn't need another explanation. You needed a memory. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The silence that followed was thicker than anger. It was disbelief, mixed with something that looked like recognition. Finally, he walked over to the table and pulled out the deed. His eyes scanned the page slowly, the reality sinking in with every line my name, the original date. The signature he had never bothered to notice before. You really never transferred it, he murmured. No, I said, and neither of you ever asked whose name was on it. You just assumed it was yours because I let you live like it was. He sat back down, rubbing his forehead. God, Mom, I don't even know how to talk to you right now. Try the truth. I said. He looked up then, his voice breaking slightly. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't mean for her to treat you like that, but you let her, I replied, softer now. And that's the same thing. He didn't argue. The fight in him had drained away. He looked around the apartment, the mismatched furniture, the faint smell of coffee and paper, the quiet. Maybe for the first time, he saw what peace looked like when it wasn't about anyone else. After a long pause, he asked, Do you hate me? I shook my head. No, I just don't recognize you anymore. He swallowed hard, then pushed the papers back toward me. I don't know how to fix this. You can start, I said, by not calling it this. You're not losing a house, Ethan. You're losing the illusion that it was ever yours. He nodded slowly, his eyes glassy. I just wanted a life that looked good. I know. I said, but good isn't the same as right. He stood and took a step toward the door, then stopped. If I said I was sorry, really sorry, would it matter? I met his gaze. Steady and tired, it would matter to you. He hesitated, then turned and left. The door clicked shut behind him, soft but final. For a moment, I stayed still, listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway. Then I walked to the window, watching the evening light settle across the city rooftops. The world outside felt calm, untouched by the conversation that had just cracked something open inside both of us. I placed the deed back in its folder and smoothed the crease where his hand had trembled against the paper. He had seen it now, seen me. Maybe for the first time. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't loss. It was truth, quiet, steady, and finally, mine. The morning the truck arrived, the street was already lined with damp magnolia leaves. A soft wind carried the scent of the river through Rutledge Avenue. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel tethered to that house. I parked a few houses down, far enough to go unnoticed. The moving company's logo gleamed on the side of the truck bright red against the pale light. 2 men were already carrying out furniture. The dining table I'd bought secondhand 20 years ago. The same one where we'd shared birthdays, holidays, and quiet breakfasts that used to mean something. From across the street, I watched as strangers dismantled the life I had built. Olivia stood on the porch, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice sharp enough to cut the air. Her hair was perfectly styled, her clothes immaculate. But her eyes darted around like she'd lost something she couldn't name. Ethan was beside her, quieter, moving between the movers and the boxes like someone caught between disbelief and resignation. I didn't hate them. That was the strange part. The anger had burned out weeks ago, leaving something else behind, something almost like peace. The front door was open wide. From where I stood, I could see through the hallway to the staircase. The light falling across the same patch of floor I'd polished 1,000 times. The walls still held faint outlines where family photos used to hang. I'd taken those down years ago, long before I moved out, when the house had already stopped feeling like home. The movers carried box after box, stacking them neatly on the curb. Olivia's voice grew louder, the kind of tone people use when they're losing control and trying to pretend they aren't. I could make out bits of her conversation, something about unfair and legal rights. I smiled faintly. Denise had been right, truth doesn't need volume. After a while, Ethan disappeared inside. When he came out again, his arms were empty. He stood on the porch, shoulders slumped, staring out toward the street like he didn't know where to look. The boy who once believed I could fix anything had finally learned what couldn't be fixed. I stayed where I was, leaning against the hood of my car. A woman walking her dog slowed as she passed, following my gaze toward the house. "Rough move?" she asked kindly. I nodded. "Something like that." She smiled, unaware of the story behind the walls, and kept walking. When the last piece of furniture was loaded, one of the movers closed the truck door with a heavy clang. Olivia flinched at the sound. Ethan turned to lock the door, then hesitated, his hand lingering on the handle as if he could still claim it. After a moment, he pocketed the keys and walked down the steps. They didn't look back. I waited until the truck pulled away and the street grew still again. The house stood empty now, sunlight filtering through its clean windows. It looked beautiful. Maybe more beautiful than ever, but stripped of everything false. I crossed the street slowly, stopping by the front gate. The wrought iron was cool beneath my fingers. I looked up at the porch, at the paint I'd brushed myself one spring afternoon, humming to fill the quiet after my husband left. Every inch of it carried a memory, but none of them hurt anymore. The wind shifted, rustling the ivy along the fence. I let my hand fall and stepped back. There was nothing left to take, nothing left to lose. I turned toward the car, the morning sun catching the edge of the windshield. The reflection flashed across my face, bright and brief, and I felt something settle inside me. Not satisfaction, not regret, but release. The house was no longer mine to protect or mourn. It was just an address again, and that was enough. The conference room smelled faintly of old wood and lemon polish. A brass clock ticked softly on the wall, each second landing like the steady beat of something coming to an end. Denise sat across from me, poised and professional as always. A neat stack of documents laid out between us. "Everything's ready," she said, sliding the final packet toward me. "The buyer wired the funds this morning. Once you sign, it's done." I glanced at the papers. Legal language filled each page, clauses, terms, transfer numbers, but I only focused on the final line, the one waiting for my signature. My name was typed beneath it in clean black ink, Marian Keaton, the same name that had once signed paychecks, loan renewals, and grocery store receipts. But this time, the weight of it felt different. Denise handed me a pen. Take your time. I smiled faintly. I've already taken plenty. The tip of the pen touched paper. My hand didn't shake. I wrote my name slowly, deliberately, as though it were the first time I'd ever signed it for myself. The sound of ink sliding across paper was almost too quiet to notice, but when it stopped, the silence in the room deepened. Denise glanced over, then nodded. That's it. That's it, I echoed. She gathered the documents, clipped them neatly together, and passed me a printed statement of confirmation. The total balance stared back at me an exact figure, precise and final. The account number underneath it was mine alone. Funds will clear by tomorrow, Denise said. You'll receive official notice once it's posted. I folded the paper and slipped it into my purse. Thank you for everything. She smiled. You did this yourself, Marian. I just helped you see it through. I stood, the chair legs scraping softly against the hardwood floor. The room seemed brighter somehow, or maybe it was just my eyes adjusting to what freedom looked like in daylight. When I stepped outside, the air was thick with early summer heat. The city moved at its usual pace, buses hissing, street vendors shouting, people passing without looking up. I walked slowly toward my car, each step light, measured, unhurried. At the intersection, I stopped to let a family cross the street. A little girl clutched her mother's hand, dragging behind her a bright red balloon that bobbed against the wind. The sight of it made something inside me ease. I remembered Ethan at that age, his sticky fingers clutching mine after Sunday service, his voice full of wonder at things that no longer amazed me. I reached the car and rested my hand on the door handle, then paused. I took out the confirmation slip again and looked at it under the sun. The ink shimmered faintly in the light. For years, I had signed papers that tied me tighter to other people's needs. This one untied me across the street. The church bells began to chime the noon hour. Their sound rolled over the rooftops, clear and resonant. I closed my eyes and let it pass through me like a blessing I hadn't known I'd been waiting for. When the last bell faded, I opened the door and slid into the driver's seat. The steering wheel was warm under my hands. I exhaled deeply, the breath leaving me slow and steady. Behind me, somewhere on Rutledge Avenue, the house I'd built was no longer mine. Ahead, the road stretched open, shimmering under the heat. And for the first time, I didn't feel loss. I felt light. The cottage was smaller than any place I'd ever lived, but it suited me. It sat near the bend of the Ashley River, tucked behind a line of cypress trees that swayed with the wind. The air there was different salted, clean, edged with the faint sweetness of marsh grass. I moved in on a Friday morning. A delivery truck left a few boxes by the porch. And when the engine faded down the gravel road, the quiet that followed felt like the closing of a long chapter. I didn't unpack right away. Instead, I stood on the porch, hands in my pockets, and looked out at the slow, brown shimmer of the river. The water moved steadily, without rush or hesitation, as if it had all the time in the world. Inside, the cottage smelled faintly of cedar and new paint. Sunlight pooled through the kitchen window, catching on the glass jars I'd already lined up on the sill basil, rosemary, thyme. I'd planted the herbs that morning, pressing the soil between my fingers the way I used to when Ethan was small and we grew tomatoes in tin buckets behind the old house. The difference was, this time, no one was watching. No one needed me to feed them, or fix anything, or make a home out of thin air. By noon, I'd unpacked the essentials: a kettle, a few dishes, my old notebook, and the typewriter Ruth had left me years ago. Its keys were stiff, some letters faint, but it still worked. I set it by the window, facing the river. That afternoon, I began to write again, not about pain, not about them, but about what it meant to start over when no one's watching. The words came slowly at first, uneven like a limp after a long recovery. But with each line, the silence around me began to sound less like loneliness and more like space. In the evenings, I walked along the riverbank, the ground soft under my shoes. Sometimes I'd see fishermen packing up for the night, or couples sitting in lawn chairs, their laughter drifting over the water. No one recognized me, and I didn't mind. There was a strange relief in being unremarkable, in not being anyone's mother, helper, or disappointment. Just a woman with her own key to her own door. One evening, near sunset, I brewed a cup of tea and carried it out to the porch. The sky was turning the color of apricots, and the last of the light shimmered through the Spanish moss hanging from the trees. I thought about the house on Rutledge Avenue, not the people, not the pain, just the structure itself, somewhere in the city. New owners were unpacking their own boxes, filling its rooms with voices that had nothing to do with mine. That thought didn't sting the way I'd expected. It felt right, even necessary, like letting a field rest after too many harvests. As the light faded, I went back inside. The cottage was small but alive in its simplicity, the kettle clicking on the stove, the faint hum of a ceiling fan, the rustle of curtains as the night breeze moved through. On the counter sat the day's mail, a letter from Denise confirming the transfer of funds, a handwritten note from the realtor congratulating me, and a small envelope with no return address. I opened the unmarked one last. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No message. Just a folded photo Ethan, as a boy, sitting on the porch steps with his hands covered in cookie dough. I smiled faintly. There was no bitterness left. Only a soft ache that felt like remembering a song you once loved but don't need to play anymore. I placed the photo on the desk beside the typewriter and turned back to the window. The river glowed faintly under the moonlight, moving slow and certain, like it had nowhere to be but there. The kettle began to whistle. I poured the water, breathed in the steam, and sat at my desk. The typewriter waited, patient and ready. I pressed the first key. The sound echoed in the quiet one small note, clear and certain. And for the first time in years, I wasn't rebuilding. I was simply living. It was late evening when the message arrived. I had just finished washing the last of the dishes. The window above the sink fogged slightly from the steam. Outside, the air was still, the river quiet beneath a silver slice of moon. My phone buzzed on the counter. One line lit the screen. I'm sorry, no name, but it didn't need one. I recognized the number, the way you recognize a voice you haven't heard in years, something that lives in the body, not the mind. For a moment, I stood there, motionless. The kettle clicked behind me as it cooled. The small cottage was filled with the soft hum of night, the sound of something steady and alive. I reread the words once, twice, until their weight settled, not heavy, not light, just real. There was a time when I would have wanted more. An explanation, a reason, maybe even a tearful apology at my doorstep. But not now. Some things didn't need to be spoken to be understood. I walked to the front door and stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked softly beneath my feet. The river breeze brushed my face, carrying the faint scent of wet pine and distant rain. I reached up to the light switch beside the door. The bulb flickered once, then bloomed into a soft, golden glow. It spilled across the steps and out into the yard, catching on the edges of the herb pots I'd lined along the railing. From where I stood, the light looked warm, but not beckoning, a quiet signal that this place was no longer one of waiting, but of being. I looked down at my phone again, the message still open in my hand. Then I typed 2 words, "Be well." I didn't wait for a reply. I set the phone on the small table beside the door and leaned against the railing, watching as the light settled over the porch. The night was deep now, the river almost black except where the moon touched it. a narrow streak of silver winding away into the dark. The world was silent, peaceful. Behind me, the house breathed with a stillness that belonged only to those who had finally stopped explaining themselves. I turned off the kettle, closed the door gently, and left the porch light on.